Imagine being condemned not for your crimes but for your face. That was Sporus' curse in Rome. The wrong nose, the wrong cheekbones, the wrong resemblance to a dead empress, and suddenly your life becomes the emperor's twisted puppet show. Nero, fresh from murdering his wife in a drunken rage, stared at Sporus like he'd seen a ghost. And in a way, he had. The poor slave's features matched the corpse in Nero's memory, and from that moment on, Sporus wasn't a person anymore. He was a resurrection project. Congratulations, Sporus. Your face just got you a death sentence and a wedding invitation. But before we bury Sporus in Nero's madness, we need to meet the woman who lit the fuse, Poppaea Sabina. Not just beautiful, weaponized beautiful. The kind of woman who could topple dynasties with a smile and make emperors dump wives like old sandals. Already twice married when Nero laid eyes on her, she was perfection dipped in poison. Her second husband was Nero's closest friend, but loyalty in Rome meant nothing. Nero banished him like spoiled food and claimed Poppaea for himself. Nothing says best friends forever like stealing your buddy's wife and mailing him to Siberia. For 5 years, Poppaea ruled the empire through Nero's bed. She didn't whisper. She hissed, and Rome bent. She talked him into murdering his mother, Agrippina. And let's be honest, mother-son dinners in that palace were already a coin toss of poison. Agrippina had poisoned her own husband, tried the same on her son, and stabbed her way into power. But when Poppaea whispered, "Mommy has to go," Nero turned the family feud into state policy. Forget family therapy. Rome's version was patricide with extra wine. Poppaea wasn't done. She pushed Nero to cut loose Octavia, his first wife, whose great sin was being boring and legitimate. Octavia was the steady one, the dull one, the one who didn't kill relatives at the dinner table. And in Nero's Rome, that was unforgivable. So she was divorced, exiled, executed. Poppaea had golden hair that became the empire's fashion standard and venom on her tongue that became Nero's compass. She was the ultimate mean girl of antiquity, beautiful, ruthless, and absolutely fatal to anyone who crossed her. If Regina George had a time machine, she'd bow to Poppaea. But power has its curse, pregnancy. In 65 AD, heavy with child, Poppaea dared to scold Nero for coming home late from the chariot races. Wrong move. He was drunk, furious, and his temper was an executioner. One kick to her stomach, and Poppaea died instantly. Mother, queen, lover, corpse. In one drunken outburst, Nero killed the only woman he had ever loved. Who needs assassins when your husband's temper does the job? That's when Nero's brain snapped like an old lute string. He drowned the empire in grief theater. Funeral games for days, her corpse smothered in spices like foreign royalty, whispers of deification. He tried to crown her a goddess because apparently, if you murder your wife, the next logical step is canonizing her. Guilt rotted him alive. He didn't want a new wife. He wanted the old one back. And that meant Rome was about to witness the ugliest casting call in history. Now hiring must resemble murdered empress. Benefits include jewelry, risk of sudden death. Nero scoured the empire for replacements, demanding golden-haired clones of the corpse he kicked. Women paraded before him, but none were perfect. Too tall, too short, wrong hair, wrong nose. Nero was a psychotic Goldilocks, searching for just right, while the empire whispered in horror. Even when he tried marrying Statilia Messalina, it collapsed. Why? Because she was her own person. Nero didn't want a wife. He wanted necromancy. Tinder in Rome must have been hell. Swipe right, lose your head. The empire watched in fear and mockery. Their emperor wasn't fiddling while Rome burned anymore. He was auditioning replacements for the corpse he loved. Even by Roman standards, where lions eating people was dinner theater, this was grotesque. But Nero wasn't finished. If he couldn't find a woman to play Poppaea, he would think outside the box. And when his eyes landed on Sporus, the slave unlucky enough to share her face, the nightmare truly began. Rome didn't need gods or monsters. It had Nero with a broken heart. When Nero's eyes locked onto Sporus, the boy's life was over. He wasn't a slave anymore. He was raw material for Nero's necrophiliac fantasy. The emperor didn't see a human being. He saw a ghost with golden hair, a replacement for the corpse he'd kicked into the grave. One glance and Sporus won history's worst lottery. Congratulations, you look like my dead wife. Now prepare for mutilation. Rome had chariot races. Sporus just got trampled by fate. The emperor's plan was simple in its insanity. If Sporus was going to be Poppaea, he had to be reshaped, carved, broken into her image. Nero's solution? Castration. Not punishment, not justice, not even medical necessity. Just a sadist's way of hammering a ghost into flesh. A boy's body turned into an altar for imperial delusion. Imagine losing your manhood not for a crime, but for your cheekbones. The operation itself was barbarism dressed as medicine. No anesthesia, no mercy, just knives and crushing tools. Sporus would have been pinned down, screaming, while Nero's butchers hacked away the parts that made him male. Blood, agony, infection, licking at the wound. Most didn't survive castration, but Sporus had the luck of being too important to die. Nero's fantasy couldn't bleed out on the table. Better to be dead than valuable to Nero, but Sporus wasn't given the choice. Surviving was only step one. Then came the dressing up, the costume of a dead empress. Women's robes draped across a mutilated frame, hair styled into Poppaea's golden crown, voice trained to mimic the softness Nero remembered. Sporus wasn't living, he was performing, every breath stolen by the identity Nero had nailed to him. Forget method acting. This was death acting, and Sporus couldn't leave the stage. Then came the grand finale, marriage. Nero didn't keep his lunacy in the shadows. He made Rome watch. A full wedding ceremony with Sporus in a flame-colored bridal veil, Nero in his groom's toga, priests chanting while senators choked on their silence. The emperor kissed his castrated bride in front of the empire, daring anyone to flinch. And no one did. Only in Rome could mutilation end with wedding cake. To Nero, it wasn't grotesque. It was love reborn. He showered Sporus with jewels, fine quarters, servants, titles. To the outside world, Sporus was a rags-to-riches miracle, but under the silk and gold, he was a prisoner wearing another woman's skin, forced to play wife to the man who had murdered the original. A gilded cage still smells like blood. The Romans whispered, joked, gossiped, but never too loudly. How do you mock your emperor marrying a castrated boy without ending up as lion food? Some laughed behind closed doors, others gagged in private, but most simply stared in stunned paralysis. It was too grotesque to process, too dangerous to criticize. Rome had birthed a spectacle no playwright could invent. The empire of gladiators was finally outshocked by its emperor. For Sporus, survival was a balancing act on the edge of a blade. Too feminine, and he risked reminding Nero of the wife he murdered. Too independent, and he risked reminding Nero that Sporus wasn't Poppaea. Every gesture, every glance, every word had to keep the illusion intact. He wasn't a man anymore, not even a slave. He was a ghost in drag, haunted by a corpse he never met. Sporus didn't live as himself. He lived as someone else's memory. Sporus's new marriage wasn't a honeymoon. It was a hostage situation wrapped in silk. Every day he woke up not as himself, but as the puppet of a dead empress. Nero paraded him around like a trophy, kissed him in public, introduced him as my wife. Rome watched, horrified, as the emperor treated mutilation as matrimony. For Sporus, the palace wasn't luxury. It was a theater where every performance was life or death. Forget Netflix drama. Rome had the live-action nightmare show. The emperor showered his bride with jewels, servants, fine quarters, the whole imperial package. On paper, Sporus had everything a Roman noblewoman could want. In reality, he was a ghost trapped in a gilded cage, suffocating under the weight of another woman's identity. He didn't own the jewels owned him. Every ring was another shackle. Every robe was another reminder that his manhood had been butchered for Nero's delusion. Gold chains don't glitter when they're welded to your soul. The worst part wasn't the luxury, it was the conversations. Nero would reminisce about Poppaea, his murdered wife, while staring into Sporus' face. Imagine nodding along while your captor coos about the woman he killed, the woman whose ghost you've been forced to embody. Every word was psychological torture, every kiss a grave robbery. Nothing's creepier than being pillow talk with a corpse. The Roman public's reaction was a twisted circus of silence. Some whispered jokes behind closed doors, others swallowed their disgust, and most pretended it wasn't happening. Because what do you say when your emperor marries a castrated slave? Congrats on the happy couple? Even the gossip-hungry Romans, who loved a scandal, choked on this one. Nero's theater had outpaced their ability to snicker. When Rome runs out of insults, you know it's bad. And Nero, he was ecstatic. In his delusion, he'd resurrected his beloved. He took Sporus everywhere. Banquets, theaters, public events. He flaunted him like victory spoils, the ultimate proof that his madness had conquered grief. Sporus wasn't a person, he was necromancy in human form, paraded to convince the emperor he wasn't guilty, he wasn't broken, he wasn't alone. Nothing screams "I'm sane" like forcing your empire to clap for a fake wife. But the balancing act for Sporus never ended. Too much femininity, and he risked reminding Nero of the corpse under the floor. Too little, and he risked shattering the illusion. Love him enough to feed the fantasy, but never enough to show he was real. He lived on a knife's edge, performing a role that could never end, where one wrong move meant the emperor's rage, and Rome knew how Nero handled rage. The job description was simple: act like my dead wife or die. By 68 AD, Rome had had enough. Rebellions erupted, the Senate branded Nero a public enemy, and the emperor spiraled into desperation. Surrounded, hated, collapsing under the weight of his own madness, he chose suicide over capture. His final words weren't apologies or repentance. "No," he whispered, "what an artist dies in me." Even at death's door, Nero thought only of himself. An artist, not a tyrant, not a butcher, not a lunatic who kicked his wife to death and mutilated a boy to replace her. Rome didn't lose an artist, it flushed a toilet. For Rome, Nero's suicide was celebration. For Sporus, it was just the start of a new nightmare. He wasn't free, he was the castrated widow of a monster, a living reminder of imperial lunacy. And reminders like him didn't live long in Rome. Nero was dead, but Sporus was still chained to his ghost. Nero's corpse was barely cold before Rome tore itself apart in the year of the four emperors. And right in the middle of this blood-soaked soap opera stood Sporus, the castrated widow of madness. What do you do with a boy mutilated into a wife, paraded as an empress, and left behind like a cursed relic? Rome had no answer, except to pass him around like imperial property. Sporus wasn't a person anymore. He was a haunted wedding ring. Enter Otho. Remember him? Poppaea's old husband, the one Nero shipped off so he could steal her. Fate brought him back as emperor, and you'd think maybe, just maybe, he'd show Sporus a shred of mercy. Wrong. Instead, he claimed Sporus for himself. If he couldn't have the real Poppaea, he'd settle for her mutilated knockoff. Revenge served cold and drag. Nothing says closure like marrying your wife's ghost replacement. For Otho, Sporus wasn't a tragedy, he was a trophy. A twisted prize reclaimed from Nero's filth. But Otho's reign lasted only 3 months before civil war chewed him up. Suicide ended his story, leaving Sporus once again adrift, the empire's most cursed keepsake. Each new emperor inherited him like a piece of furniture soaked in blood. Rome didn't crown emperors. They just kept auditioning Sporus's next owner. Then came Vitellius, a man who decided that if Sporus couldn't be a bride, he could at least be entertainment. He dragged Sporus into gladiatorial games, forcing him to play the role of a raped maiden in front of thousands. Imagine the screams of a boy already mutilated for one emperor, now mocked as theater for another. Trauma turned into public spectacle. Survival turned into a cruel punchline. Rome didn't do reality TV, they did reality torture. The crowd roared, the emperor smirked, and Sporus endured. But humiliation was more lethal than the blade. He had been a wife, a widow, a parody of a maiden, and still Rome demanded more. Every emperor found a new way to twist the knife, as if mutilating his body wasn't enough. They had to mutilate his soul too. In Rome, the cruelty never died, it just changed costumes. Finally, Vespasian rose to power, bringing stability after the chaos. For Sporus, stability didn't mean safety. He knew what came next. A new emperor, a new round of humiliation, a fresh horror dreamed up by a system that had never spared him. And this time, he chose his fate. Sporus ended his life, the one act of control he'd been denied since Nero first laid eyes on him. Suicide was his liberation, his rebellion, his only escape from being Rome's eternal corpse bride. When death feels like freedom, you know life was hell. Sporus' death didn't end his story. It carved it into Rome's memory like a scar that never healed. He wasn't remembered as a man, or a slave, or even as Nero's victim. He was remembered as the boy whose face cursed him, whose resemblance turned him into a parody of love and a monument to madness. His life proved that in Rome, you didn't need to commit a crime to be destroyed. Looking like the wrong person was enough. In Nero's world, identity theft was punishable by mutilation. What made Sporus's nightmare unique wasn't just the violence, it was the logic behind it. Nero didn't castrate him for punishment. He did it because power meant he could remake reality itself. Laws, armies, gods, none of that mattered. If the emperor wanted his dead wife back, he'd carve her into the flesh of a terrified boy. That wasn't love. That wasn't grief. That was raw power stripped naked, wielded like a knife. Nero didn't resurrect Poppaea. He butchered Sporus into a hallucination. Rome preserved the tale not because it shocked them. They were a society that cheered as lions ripped men apart. No, they preserved it because Sporus' life was the perfect mirror of empire itself. Absolute power meant absolute distortion. When an emperor could twist a slave into a bride, reality itself bent to imperial lust. That was Rome's truth. People weren't people, they were props. Forget marble statues. Rome sculpted its empire out of human misery. The tragedy wasn't just Nero, it was everyone else. Senators who watched the wedding in silence. Crowds who laughed at Sporus' humiliation. Courtiers who bowed and pretended mutilation was matrimony. Rome didn't just allow the horror, it applauded it, dressed it in silk, and called it divine. The empire wasn't corrupted by Nero alone. It was corrupted by everyone who let him play God unchecked. Tyrants don't exist without audiences. Rome clapped until the blood dried. Sporus' story shows the ugliest truth about power. When no one says no, the human body becomes clay for the ruler's hands. A face becomes a curse. A life becomes theater. A person becomes a ghost trapped in someone else's fantasy. That's why the Romans remembered him, not out of pity, but because they recognized themselves in the cruelty. Sporus was just the unlucky mirror. The empire didn't just mutilate Sporus, it mutilated itself. In the end, Sporus found the only freedom Rome couldn't twist: suicide. His death was his rebellion. The one moment he wasn't someone else's property, someone else's wife, someone else's parody. He took back his body by ending it, leaving Rome with a ghost it couldn't control. And centuries later, we still remember his face, the face that ruined him. Nero tried to resurrect Poppaea, but all he raised was a legend of horror.